Good evening.
Welcome, Scholar. That clip is from Monty Python's Flying Circus, which is what inspired the name Python, not the snake. Python, programming language, very important and everywhere, from machine learning to automating a lot of stuff away. So there are two ways to get started. One of them is by downloading the Python from here. You can just straight download, or we can use a compiler. So a compiler is essentially that, but in an easier form. So if this is your first day programming and you are curious to learn, we'll talk our way through what this is. This is essentially a .py file means .py, which is how the Python files are saved, and they will be saved virtually here. We'll press run to tell the computer to get started, and it will output something here. So, the same way we speak languages, Python is a language, and we'll learn the syntax and the grammar rules as we progress. The first thing we have to learn is a thing called a variable. A variable essentially is a container that stores value. It can literally hold anything from a number to a string to multiple arguments, but for now, it will hold a number. The equal operator is how we tell it to quote-unquote store something. Equal doesn't mean what math means. This is an assignment operator that tells, hey, take this thing I'm gonna put on this side, put it in this container. So for now, let's just start with something simple, 2 plus 1. So 2 plus 1 is called a value. Again, that's being stored in a thing called variable. This can literally be anything. It doesn't matter as long as we use an equal sign next to it. So if we want the computer to speak back to us, we will have to print it. Print is a function that essentially tells the computer, hey, whatever I gave you in here, I want you to say it back to me. So it's telling us that's equal. Wait, you can have many variables, and variables can be anything essentially, but for now, another variable name could be something. These are clever names, but essentially, usually if you're programming, you want it to be something direct, so your future self knows what you were doing. Something, this can be some really complex number, but we will have to change the name. If we want to print both, we can use a comma and do that here. That's the first number, and that's the second number. Another important thing to notice is data types. So integers are one type of data, and another ones are floats. A float is essentially anything that's a decimal number, say 3.14. An integer is anything that's a whole number, like 333. These differently in a Python program, so we have to be aware what we're using. You print float, it will run the program and tell you what that is. But this is kind of boring. Like, we don't want to keep doing this over and over again. We want to start doing something fun and exciting. That's when we can start using operators. We can do addition. For instance, we can say float plus int, and it will do the math. I probably should pick a simpler number next time. Let's do 2, and it will do that. We can multiply. We added, we multiplied. We can do division. Now we want to do other things. There are different types of data. There's the int, which are integers, and there are texts, which is the infamous hello world. Hello world is a text that is wrapped under quotation marks. It can be a single or a double quote. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that quotation needs to open and close for the program to know what we're talking about. And it will print hello world. So the interesting thing about strings is that numbers could also be strings. Python doesn't care as long as you put it in a quotation mark. it will treat it as a string. Right now it seems harmless because it's just 2, but if we wanted to do more complex things, then we'll run into a problem. For instance, let's say we want to add 2 plus 2. But we want to do it in a string format for some reason. Oops, remember to put that in there. We press run. Now it's 22 instead of 4. That's because we're using a string, and when we use this addition sign, Python thinks you're trying to combine those two. So addition, when it comes to string, is used to combine or concatenate two numbers or two whatevers together, essentially. So you can add 2 plus 2 and it will give us 22. We usually don't go around the world adding two things together, but what we do is we can combine different information. So for instance, if we want to run this program and we want to combine first name and last name, there are 2 things we can do. Again, plus for strings means not addition, but combination, let's just call it. Oh, it combined them, but it smushed them together. So what we can do is we can add a space between them. That way, this quotation mark will give us an empty string. Oh, sorry. This space will give us an empty string by pressing run. Another simpler way to do it probably would be to use just a comma between those two, and it will slice them together. Again, if I wasn't clear, we have to be wary of how we assign variables, because we can change them without us being aware. So if we run this program, that her name now has changed. The computer has changed what it was pointing to, and now it's pointing at Bono, so we have to be cautious. So we can concatenate strings, but we can also combine them by using a simple comma. In the future, we'll use F and all that jazz, but for now, let's just keep it simple and do it that way. But what if we need to ask the user for their name? One thing we can do is a thing called input. So input is essentially asking the user the information we require from them. So it will come here, what is your name? My name is Mac. And it will print my name here. But what if we want to say hello to me or anybody? We can essentially do, again, we want to use a comma to separate these two, otherwise it won't run. And then it can ask, you can essentially ask anything you want from a person. And you can combine that later. And then, so we will go here. We want to print color, but we want to tell them their favorite color. And we press run. Again, we'll ask our name. Let's just say pink. Nice. But now that was us getting input from the user, and we were strictly using strings. We know this because there's a quotation mark. However, all input, essentially what we ask of the user and the user tells us, gets translated into a string. Like numbers, floats, anything would be translated into a string. So we need to explicitly tell the computer to take that string and change it into an integer or a float, depending on what we want. For example, if we want to ask them their age, and we want to tell them, hey, next year you'll be this years old, we would have to do int input, open another parentheses, and then say how we want to say next year you will be age plus. I could actually want to do this without putting int so you can see the error message that it will give us. Because all input that the user gives us eventually gets translated as a string, so we need to translate it back. So let's say I am 88. Oh, it thinks we're trying to combine age and the number. So a simple way to solve that is to just add int in front of it. And let's tell it that, again, this thing, we have to be careful. That's irrelevant for now. I'm 99 now. Next year I'll be 100. Great. So is also another solution, which is a bit tedious, but we will do it because it's important to understand. I can take the input the user gives me, and then I can translate it back into a string. Into an integer. One way to do that is to literally apply and age and then run the program. But since this is tedious, we just simply put int in front of the input. If we are adding floats, it will be different. Let's say, for now, I want to use temperature because that's the easiest to do. Because temperature usually can come in forms of a decimal, we want to be able to do a float instead of an int. So we can just simply float input Oh, that's because I forgot to put the comma in the right place. Thank you. Let's say is 60, that might be a little 55.4. Now, another part where this will come in handy is if we want to change temperature to, let's say, Celsius, or from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So let's do that. The Celsius we want is what the user gives us, but we don't know what Celsius is, so we have to translate it into Fahrenheit. And I believe the equation is Celsius times 9/5 plus 32, if I'm not mistaken, is, I think, 44. And now we will change it. Had this not been a float, then we will get an error message. Okay. So that essentially is it. We learned some interesting things. If you remember, let's quickly review. We learned how to store and assign variables. That just a var or any name equals a value that assigns it. We learned how to manipulate data. We can take a string and change it into an int. We also learned how to print data and how to get input from users by simply asking input parentheses question. And remember, all input is a string, so we need to change it if we need to manipulate it in any way. We know how to run a variable, we know how to print, we know how to reassign, because you can reassign a variable if you are not careful and aware. We understand the difference between int and float. Int just means it's a whole number, float is a decimal. Basic arithmetics is the equations. You can just simply Google it. It won't take more than 5 minutes for you to comprehend. hopefully. We understand data types, which is this is a string, correct, and not a number. And strings are anything in quotation marks. And to combine them, we can use a plus sign or a comma. Again, input from users and change it accordingly to how we need it. Yeah, and that's it. That's the first episode, the first introductory experience of Python. Hopefully you had fun and it's not too boring. And I will see you on the next one. Until then, go break some code.